Ooh. Oh, contact my table. But like, when we're done, we'll just go upstairs?
Yeah, and we'll just chat.
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely.
I can always draw it out as like, I'll take my time.
Yeah, don't feel rushed. We've got yeah, we'll give people a few minutes.
Oh, yeah.
People tend to be like, just slightly latecomers. Yeah, it's actually it's your favorite. Yeah, it's like the what's the only like.
I don't realize how big China is.
It's so much fun. I thought about Calgary is like
I haven't been to the it's like massive, and they have like artists talking about it. There's this like this amount.
right.
But
Everyone seems to have like the biggest time
Shit. So it feels like it was there. Whereas in a tiny.
I don't know.
Yep.
The chairs are like, they was like fancy, and I was like, well, this is such overkill for like,
For just
we
little
could do
midway
this in
stuff.
like, yeah, in a little classroom. But it was like, they had just timed it wrong.
Yeah, I like this place because it's like Chinese people show up here.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah.
I really like those numbers.
Yeah, totally. Okay, this is very, very dignified.
And then you're going away?
Yeah.
Are you gonna go upstairs?
set up stuff.
I thought you were not working.
After 7.
I tried to take a little nap,
Okay.
but it was only like 10 minutes.
After I get where everything's
Well,
settled.
right when I was getting into good sleep mode, it was like, and I was like, oh,
Time to get up.
and it's okay. I ate some Cheetos and then brushed my teeth.
Yeah.
But we went to Mimosa again.
I went to the mall and I bought these totes. They're sparkly.
They are.
I bought some sparkly. I bought sparkly
sorry.
totes. I also bought because I'm leaving. I'm going to Winnipeg tomorrow morning, like early. And I was like, wow, I've done laundry and laundry.
Yeah, you're like, oh, you should do this.
Right, wax and underwear and tights.
Yeah. Instead of doing those.
You're wrong. And I was like, there, good. That's the case there. About maybe 2-3
And
times a
then
year.
before that, oh yeah.
Okay, I'm not ours to do laundry. I'm just gonna buy my things.
Do it.
Excitedly. All right. Should we get going? Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to an artist talk by Calgary-based artist Marigold Santos, held in conjunction with the opening of her Dunlop Central Gallery exhibition, MALAGINTO, which will be opening at 7 p.m. upstairs. Please come and join us for that. My name is Blair Fornwald, and I am Curator of Moving Image and Performance at Dunlop Art Gallery and RPO Film Theatre. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we're gathered on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Ojibwe, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis. I would also like to thank Dunlop's key funders, the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Saskatchewan Arts Board, Sask Culture, and Saskatchewan Lotteries. And of course, I'm very, very grateful to Marigold for being with us tonight and for her beautiful work. Please join me in welcoming Marigold Santos.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yeah, perfect. Great. So, good evening, and thank you to everyone here for making it out to the artist talk. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Dunlop for inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to speak a little bit about my background and my journey through my art practice, through the many projects, and I'll speak for about 30 minutes with some time after for a Q&A. But I also want to mention that though this is a presentation of my work, I like to approach these talks as a conversation between myself and you. So if you feel inclined to ask a question during the presentation, you can, though it's a little hard for me to see you. If I do this, I might see your hand come up. So, or if I don't, you just want to say, question, that's totally okay. But if you're more comfortable waiting after, that's totally fine. And also the opening is at 7, so you can approach me after and speak to me. That's also really nice for me too. So even though I've been invited to many talks, I still find it challenging to summarize my work because I have a diverse practice and I allow myself to explore these tangents and these avenues, and I really can engage in all of the different tangents that I take. But ultimately they return to the common threads of my work, and those threads are identity and selfhoods informed by our environment and our lived experiences and how that can be ultimately empowering to us. So just a bit about my background. I now live and work in Calgary, but I've traveled across Canada and moved across the country a couple times. And I've worked as a full-time artist and from time to time taught at universities like Concordia University in Montreal, where I lived for 11 years, and MacEwan University in Edmonton, where I've taught drawing, painting, self-directed research courses, and all sorts of art courses. But I wasn't always living in Canada. And in fact, I was born in the Philippines. So this photo was taken in the Philippines. This is my mom and my brother and our cousin in the front yard. And this photo was taken just before my family immigrated to Canada in 1988. And here we are in our first stop in North America. You might recognize New York City in 1988. The Twin Towers in the back, and the Santos family dressed in our finest denim. It's important for me to speak about my family's immigration because in my work it stands as an autobiographical point of departure, where all of my work really stems from. I turn to this really important time in my life as I reflect on loss of language, the language you understand, the acquisition of a new one because I had to learn English, and in a new landscape, both geographical and social, and the resilience and the adaptation that's required in order to feel comfortable as a kid. So when I started to make work in my MFA at Concordia University, I took these reflections and began thinking about what an individual might feel like when they leave one home behind for another, and considering feelings of fragmentation, of identity, and selfhood again. And these ideas then manifested in imagery I first started making that spoke about multiplicity of self, specifically twinning. And I made a body of drawings that addressed the feeling of multiple selfhoods that I imagined what my life might be like had my family not immigrated and had not chosen to leave, and who I might have become. And I was also forced to reflect on our immigration at this time because I'd moved again from Calgary to Montreal to pursue my MFA, and here I was once again uprooted, where I didn't understand the language and the social politics, and in a new program tried to reconcile that and navigate my way around. And so at this time, I started to think conceptually about what we do when we uproot and what we actually take with us versus what we leave behind. And because I was a child during the immigration, what I took with me was not material belongings, but was the narratives and the stories that was told to me as a kid in the Philippines, and specifically the folklore of the Philippines. And in this folklore, there is a character called an Aswang, which has since then become adopted to represent all of my work at this point. So you'll hear me say that word, or that name, Aswang, quite a bit. So depending on region to region and who's telling the story, there isn't a singular way of understanding this creature. Traditionally, an Aswang has an inherent multiple self and is a hybrid of a witch and a ghoul who's a shapeshifter and a feared creature. So most often the Aswang is depicted as a woman, who by day looks like a regular person, but at night has the ability to self-sever at the waist. So you can see here, discarding her lower half while her upper half flies around at night, and she eats babies and viscera, so she's quite macabre. And she only to join with her lower half at the end of the night, or she'll die fragmented. There are many tales and variations of the tales of the Aswang, and in my research I had a really good time looking those up and learning about them. Like, for instance, you can tell if she's an Aswang if you put your head between your legs and look upside down, and you know, if she's upside down, then that's revealed. Or if you see that somebody has bloodshot eyes. And these are one of the few prints that I made when I was at Concordia, and I was playing on these stories that I was thinking about. Like, for instance, what if you look upside down and you appear upside down to someone else? Or what if you come home to your bottoms and there's more than one bottom, and what happens if you get mixed up? This is kind of tongue-in-cheek about that stuff too. And so then the work started to evolve even further, and I started to make more and more images of figures hybriding not only with themselves, so like person to person, but person to object, and body parts to object, and landscapes and environments. So this one's a three-headed Aswang with a fire on their belly, and they're breaking in half, right where like that midpoint would be. And as they extinguish this fire, they also fan the flame. So there's a cyclicality that's starting to happen. At this point, I started researching really intensely about the Aswang, and it led to a few papers. So mainly this one by Herminia Meñez called The Viscera Sucker and the Politics of Gender. And it's in a book called Explorations in Philippine Folklore. And it started to reflect all of this research in my drawings. In this essay, she speaks about the birth of the Aswang complex through the colonization of the Philippines, the colonization of the egalitarian indigenous communities of the Philippines by the Spanish for 300 years. So that's between like 1521 to 1898. And there's a complex history where the Babaylan, so that's the name of the healers or the female shamans of the society, they were the midwives, they were the storytellers, they were the figures who had access to the afterlife. They, in the attempt to missionize, were demonized, and they were villainized in an attempt to convert. And so where they were once life givers, they became life takers, and then in this inversion, the Aswangs were born. So this same drawing also exists in multiple ways, and it can be seen under UV light. So it's called Dusk Ardor, and so the themes are obviously fleeing and flight and distress. It's a larger landscape of an Aswang, so the whole landscape is an Aswang this time, is breaking. And then the UV started to represent something else in the drawing, what is called an anito, which is like the spiritual, maybe counterpart of an Aswang. So an Aswang is more physical, and though it exists outside of social order, and then the anito is more like the spiritual ancestors that are not evil or scary. And then this is the same drawing again, but in full black light. So you can see again, even in my artwork, they do exist in multiple ways when I present them. And then just for scale, this piece is, I think this one is 13 feet by 6 feet high. So they're pretty big, these drawings. So here is another very big drawing you can see. This next body work is called Haunted Talisman, and it was my thesis work. So all of that research in Montreal culminated to this, and it fused together all of those themes that I was working on, with the emphasis of the body being a magical object. So the talisman, or an amulet that's fragmented, it's reconfigured, it's monstrified, it embraces unfixity and plurality. There's landscape, and it's also the corridor between the other world and the lived experience. So this was a mixed media painting, and this image shows the scale of the canvas. And up until this point, I was just really working on paper, but I really wanted to do an even bigger jump, and so the only thing that could accommodate that really big jump was working on canvas. But I continued to sort of make marks on them like I would a drawing. But then I started to, use paint and charcoal, all sorts of things. So here are those that one drawing in the far back wall, and it was presented at Parisian Laundry in Montreal in the really massive bunker space. And it was this concrete old boiler room with no windows. It was quite dramatic in there. And in this image, 4 Aswang play this game, light as a feather, stiff as a board. Who knows what that is? Yeah, some of you do. And for those who don't know what it is, it's sort of this like sleepover game that you might play when you're a kid. And everybody gathers around, kneeling, and this one person would be lying on the ground, and then you lightly touch underneath them, and then you chant, light as a feather, stiff as a board, light as a feather. And communally, you're supposed to like conjure this energy to like levitate this figure, this person who's your friend. You're probably 10. So in this image, the Aswang are playing that game to the 5th one, and they're each made out of different elements. And the 5th one is levitating, and it's made out of woven material. At this point, you're going to see a lot of woven material in my work, woven imagery. They're in an environment that's in turmoil, and there's a bit of a storm, you can see. So that's paired with the second painting in the series, and that's called Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board 2, where the figure floats in a color field, and it's void of specificity, unlike the other one. Where those other Aswang were in like a physical space, this represents more of a psychological space, where they're absent, and where they are absent, it's revealed that the figure is actually severed in all those areas that they were standing before. And the body is now literally made of wood and stiff as a board. And I mention these two because later on in the slideshow, you'll see that there are actually 2 out of a series of 4. So in total, there's 4 paintings that exist that are this large. So the other element of this exhibition was a life-sized 4-ton fiberglass cast of my body as an Aswang balancing on one foot, while the other one precariously stands somewhere else in the gallery, and it's supported by these jutting crystals. So quite a scary figure, that one. And this particular sculpture, I had to learn many skills in order to create it. So a lot of like sculpture skills and wig making. So under this massive shroud of hair is a nude cast of my body at that time. So only gallery technicians and curious kids have seen what's underneath there. So this next slide is one of the few oil paintings that I'd ever made, and there's a big body of work that I've skipped. The last images that you saw with the cast sculpture, that was like 2011 and 12. And this now jumps to 2015. And the years in between is many years, and you can see if you want to look it up online, lots of different tangents that I take. But in this talk, because I'm only talking for 30 minutes, I really just kind of summarize things so that it would be more applicable to what's upstairs, and you guys can make some relationships to that. But this painting in 2015 is one of the few oil paintings I ever made, and it's important to mention because this again is another tangent where the Aswang has now morphed to represent gestures and to be depicted in this amorphous shroud. So instead of just being that traditional depiction of like an actual figure with the long hair, it starts to evolve, and the shroud becomes other things. So like in this one, it's a woven blanket. Again, the hair can be to protect and to comfort, and so is this garment, taking themes from my previous works. And then the flowers begin to become present more and more in my work, and here they are in these woven flowers. They begin to represent the absent body. And at this point, I start making smaller drawings rather than big paintings. And the drawings are ink drawings to complement all the big paintings that I was doing. So ink is a material, it can be layered, but it also is permanent. So it was a good exercise and worked conceptually too with my work. The long black hair of the Aswang, as you can see now, become these shrouds that sort of conceal the body. But instead of the garments being actually garments that conceal your body, they're in fact descriptions. So what they are conceptual descriptions of experience. Every shroud is a second skin that reveals rather than conceals, and it morphs to be a garment of protection or a second skin where every mark of ink is a mark of experience. And it's very personal work for me at this point. And it starts to really, I mean, all of it is quite personal, but at this point it's relating to the journey of my living and dividing my time between two cities, so Montreal and Calgary, which I was always back and forth with, and negotiating the multiple lives and personalities that you kind of have to have. And there was this internal conflict of which is truly home and how home is really where you are. But if you're feeling divided, sometimes you embrace it, even if it's a dark place. And then more botany starts to become present, an exploration again of this absent body through flowers and to represent limbs or fragments of a whole. And these figures start to become characters that will later be really present in my work often. So they're reoccurring characters, like this figure here with the big black hat. And then the Aswangs were in conversation with each other. So in these drawings, I would make almost like tableaus of them doing certain things. And in doing so, they were then also in conversation with themselves, because they're multiples of themselves in essence. And then as I did this, my relationship to ink became stronger and my affinity to the shroud became more complex. And I would challenge myself with how I was able to depict these emotions that I was thinking about, these concerns and the questions, and also visual challenges through the Aswang. So I wanted to expand how the shrouds were depicted, so not always just in one way. But also, at this point, I wanted to expand the surface that these shrouds were being depicted on. So not just paper or canvas. Their skin, I'm drawing as well onto something. So then I expanded my practice at this point, and I began doing ceramics. And I was taught how to wheel throw by a ceramicist in Montreal named Marigold, and she was gracious enough to workshop with me and teach me how to wheel throw at this point. And some of the stuff that I made here, you'll see upstairs. So then my surface expanded, and so did the depiction of the Aswang, as I mentioned. And this time around, the Aswang then starts to include patterns, so floral patterns, amorphous patterns, geometrical patterns, to describe the experiences that we wear as we perform them, hide behind them, or wear them in the forefront. Always ambiguous to where the figure begins and ends, sometimes also gender fluid. And then also what starts to appear more and more are these disarticulated hands, which were always really present, but they became descriptive, like they were telling a story in their gestures that are emotive. And fragments of self and of objects then start to become celebrated, and they become compounded together and gathered and made new, made whole, made over. And this particular series was called Gatherer. And at this time, another term was also born with my Aswang, which is the term weepers. It also came from another body of work too, called Invisible Mother, and from the Gatherer shrouds. So this one here is a drawing with pastel on paper. And in these weepers, their shrouds are their emotionalities. So sometimes overwhelming their visage with their hair or objects, almost absurdly, and very colorful. And sometimes these weepers, they would weep in ambiguous ways, so joyful, fearful. I made a lot of work that dealt with emotions, and I wasn't shy to call them that. I think that often we shy away from making work that addresses our subjectivity. I know that when I was in art school, it was all about keeping those things at arm's length if you were going to be taken seriously. But I threw those out the window and I was like, nope, I'm going to just start making work that really deals with our vulnerability when I started making those shrouds. And so I wanted to express embracing emotionality. Our vulnerabilities as humans is a symbol of strength and not weakness. So like too often, emotional has a negative connotation, and it can be assigned genders. But The true sign of change and progress is when we as humans can face emotional journeys and acknowledge them as part of our human experience. So then with this, I began my next massive painting, and this is the 4th installment of the levitating figure you've already seen. And this picture was taken of me at work in my studio in Montreal. You can see how tall this painting is. Often I'd be on a ladder for hours, up and down, and standing back and forth, and coming forward. It was really exhausting, and it was a physical labor of love, as you can say. And this floating figure encompasses all of the research to date then. The figure is covered in a woven shroud, and its appendages are severed, yet floating. So this image here would be the feet. Can you see that through there? And this part's the head. And you can see the body is made up of cosmos, maybe a little bit better in the next slide. And just on a technical note, this is a mixed media on canvas, so a lot of pigment and acrylic paint. So where there's a tear in this fabric, it opens up to galaxies, nebula, larger universes within the container of this body. This part is the thigh and some fingers. So I can really only take photographs and fragments of this image because it's so big. So where the figure is severed, it's dripping like melted wax. And entangled in the woven shroud are flowers, both dry and vibrant. Again, now you can start to see the reoccurring visual vocabulary that I have. And again, now it's been solidified that flowers present in my work represent growth and limbs and the surrogate body and being fragments of a whole. And at the very lowest part of the canvas is a really bright sunset type sky, and almost like a Chinook blanket with a division of color, which is a nod to the prairies. And in addition to that work, I started creating hundreds of these tiny hand-formed objects, and specifically their teeth made out of epoxy putty that became really rock hard, and I formed them into this army of uprooted molars, and then I gold leafed each and every one. This is very tedious, and they were to be presented with the large painting that we were just looking at the Alberta Biennial of Contemporary Art in 2017, and that was at the AGA in Edmonton. So here is a close-up of those gold objects. It's called Constel Alchemy, which is a combination of the word constellation and alchemy, the gold. And they're suspended around the painting, and the painting was titled Sublimation, which refers to the changing of states from solid to gas. So you can see here that they kind of float off the wall about an inch or so, depending on, and they're pinned onto these walls by these gold pins, but you don't see them. So from the front, they just look like they're floating with a tiny, maybe a little bit of a shadow. So it's kind of difficult to translate the scale of this piece, and even this photograph doesn't do it justice because I'm standing quite forward from it. It's quite enormous. It's, I believe this one was like 18 feet or something, 18 by 10 or something like that. I can get that for you. I should know. But you can feel in this shroud like the heaviness of it. And the figure is levitating up, and then it's kind of being weighted down by this super heavy woven shroud. While the dispersion of like these gold objects are more concentrated at the bottom and then less on the top, sort of a reversal of each other. And from that heavy shroud, the next drawings address the heaviness again, but of emotional weight. And the shroud becomes tangles of these woven serpents, and the body becomes littered with ink blots. So it's not just on this garment anymore. The ink is now literally on these bodies. And the shroud markings evolve to be direct. So again, going from really big to really small. This drawing would be like this big. Again, similar to ceramics, I was looking for another surface to expand my imagery on. And so here I am tattooing. And for me, tattooing not only created an enormous learning curve, so there's different surfaces, there's different textures, but it also relieved a sense of isolation that you can create when you are alone in the studio making work. Tattooing involves interacting with living, breathing people. The ink is permanent, as we know. The skin bleeds and it stretches, and a tattoo morphs and it changes over time, and it follows the wearer throughout their lives. So here's another shroud on a leg. And I wanted to be able to give access to my work to those who were looking for another way to engage with it and own it, that weren't able to afford the traditional drawings or the paintings. I'll speak more about tattoos in a little bit, but what I found so profound was the intimacy and the sharing that happens between myself and the clients during a tattoo session. Tattooing was also important to me because there's a huge pre-colonial tattooing tradition in the Philippines. So marking ink on skin is actually part of my ancestry. And I wanted to acknowledge that aspect of my heritage in my own work. And if you want to know more about that, I recommend watching this series. It's on the APTN network, and it's called Skindigenous. Has anyone ever watched that? It's so good. Episode 1 is about Wangod, who is the oldest lady who tattoos in the Philippines, and she's part of the Kalinga tribe in the Cordillera Mountains up north, and she's the oldest living tattooer who's a woman. She's like over 100 years old, and she's still doing it. And adorning the body with images and design that are important and significant to us allow us to claim our bodies. So that's a really important theme for me. And our bodies become landscapes of experience, like the ink on the shrouds, right? So here, the ink is literally on our bodies again. That intimacy and community and acknowledging emotionality during tattooing also led to the next body of paintings, specifically featuring landscapes. So here you might see a little bit of a jump. These landscapes are what I call emotional landscapes. They're dreamy and they're surreal and otherworldly, which become collaged experiences from the hikes that I've taken, through the desert and Canadian landscapes that I've seen. And they feature foliage and plant life from these explorations that I found. And I found that they spoke to me through their anthropomorphization. So I would humanize the plant life that I would encounter, and I would project my thoughts and my feelings and concerns onto them and see an absent body. And it was as if their position and their gesture was describing something that I was experiencing. So I was mirroring back possibly what I thought that I was seeing. Some of them were obvious objects, like this massive Joshua tree, but what I wanted to express was the vastness and the openness, the gradation of color in the atmosphere, to represent like a spectrum of emotionality and the gesture of the plant life. They were descriptions essentially of complex emotional landscapes. They were silent and dangerous simultaneously. The desert and a lot of the areas that we traverse can be dangerous terrain. And they were distinctly exterior. They really felt like they were outside. So at the same time, I created a body of drawings to complement those exterior paintings, and they were shrouded bodies, but within interior spaces. And so I called these arid interiors. And again, this is going from the big to the small, and these are ink on paper. And in these images, they comprise of objects that surrounded me on the daily. They're part of my home and my studio, so all the objects that appear here. And then you can see the actual paintings in the background. So it contextualizes them in some way and bridges these together. The shrouds were nude and powerful and comfortable, And they describe a body that I'm familiar with. And I was comfortable using myself as a model, as I've done in the past many times. And all of that work that you just saw was shown in a solo exhibition at the AGA, also in Edmonton, as mentioned before, in February, this past February. I was teaching at MacEwan University at the time, so I was really grateful that my students were able to come and see the work. It was my first exhibition that really bridged all of that work together. The recent research and the landscapes and the bodies and the emotionalities. And it also included my tattoo practice in that exhibition. So here I am at the opening with my good friend Lou. They're a transgender man, and they had asked me to tattoo over their top surgery scars. So you can see the giant photographs in the back. There's 4 of them, and those were photographs of Lou's session, of me tattooing Lou. I collaborated with an artist based in Calgary named Stacey Watson. And so here's a close-up of the image that I had tattooed on Lou, and they'd asked me to tattoo one of my landscapes on them. And the desert also means quite a bit to Lou. And this project took 2 4-hour sessions. And the documentation comes from the second session. So the first session was a lot of outlining, and then the second one was a lot of filling that in once it was healed and shading it. And the work ties together the ideas of the body as a landscape that we experience and map, and that the landscape itself is our bodies in their own way. And here in the big yellow piece, you can see the 3rd iteration of that levitating figure. And this one came after the pink one, but I'm presenting it to you as the last one. It's called Regrounding, and it was done in 2012. And it shows the levitating figure now settling back down into the earth, sort of fragmenting and maybe decomposing. This one is mixed media. So watercolor and pigment and acrylic paint. I think there's some marker in there. So the figure is being absorbed by the foliage, decomposing and regenerating, and it's in the process of transforming. You can see that the severed areas are highlighted, but this time they're highlighted with gold leaf as a way to mirror in some ways. So even though it was done a while ago, it's still relevant in the work that I do today. Because as you can see, my work is cross-referential, and they can inform one another. And they form like a reoccurring visual vocabulary. So where did I go from there? Since that exhibition, I made a giant body of work from ceramics. And here's a batch in the kiln, or just coming out of the kiln. I had learned more ceramic techniques, like hand building and slab building from Mariev again. And I started to create more objects that I was able to put real 22 karat gold on, and also draw on the surface. So much like drawing and tattooing on the body, these are the works that comprise of the exhibition upstairs called MALAGINTO, which translates to golden. It addresses all of the themes mentioned, acknowledging the folklore and history of my heritage. Gold is a major element in pre-colonial Philippines, but also working with clay in order to represent the surface of the body. So I build them, and as I build on them, I draw, and then I mark them directly. And in the exhibition, you'll see vessels upstairs, plant life, organically shaped objects, a lot of teeth to represent fragmentation and uprootedness, and plenty of depictions of various Aswang. You'll also see a video projection that I made called Gold Woman. It's a 26-minute film featuring a golden effigy, larger-than-life woman made of gold, burning on a pyre in the middle of arid-seeming landscape. And you can watch her be consumed by fire and smoke entirely for the duration of the film. Accompanying this film is a soundtrack that was a collaboration between my brother, friend, musician Mood Hussein, who lives in Berlin, that comprises of changing tune, tempo, atmosphere, as he works with a recording of my voice reciting a poem that I wrote in English and in Tagalog. And the lyrics of this poem is on the wall of the gallery, so you'll see it. And it describes the cyclicality of this gesture and how the ashes become carbon that become ink that we mark our skin with. And in this dust, we ink ourselves with our past histories, impressing and imprinting on us the histories of our ancestors as we create new meanings and new experiences, new histories, building and rewriting our own. And ultimately, it's really talking about empowering ourselves with the foundations of our past and renewal of the present and of our future. And the color here is a little bit more vibrant than what you might see in the gallery because there's a lot of lighting, but this is sort of a little bit more true to the color. So there you go. If you're curious and you want to know more, you'd like to have a closer look at some of those works, like the materials or the dates or the sizes or the titles of those pieces, you can go on my website, which I promise is 5 years out of date. And then, but there's also Instagram, which I do use often to post about my recent work, so you can also there. Yeah, so thank you guys so much.